Trump, and I knew this question would come up actually for almost every person that was under consideration. Sure. And that was past comments that you had made about him. And when I'll tell you after what his response was, but sure. you didn't have the nicest things to say about him back in 2016, which seems like a long time ago now. You know, you literally said, you texted a friend that Trump is a cynical a-hole like Nixon who wouldn't be that bad and might even prove useful, and that he's America's Hitler. And you compared him to a cultural heroine in the Atlantic Monthly. And I'll tell you Trump's response, but you said that then. What do you say to people that say, well, wait a minute. Sure. What did he mean?
Well, Sean, I don't hide from that. I was certainly skeptical of Donald Trump in 2016, but President Trump was a great president, and he changed my mind. I think he changed the minds of a lot of Americans because, again, he delivered that peace and prosperity. If you go back to what I thought in 2016, another thing that was going on, Sean, is I bought into the media's lies and distortions. I bought into this idea that somehow he was going to be so different, a terrible threat to democracy. It was a joke. Joe Biden is the one who's trying to throw his political opposition in jail. Joe Biden is the one who's trying to undermine American law and order. President Trump did a really good job. And I actually think it's a good thing when you see somebody, you were wrong about him, you ought to admit the mistake and admit that you were wrong.
When I brought it up to him, he said...
I can't wait for this.
Okay, when I brought it up to him, he said... Yeah, he goes, but he doesn't think that way now, does he? So he actually had a very good sense of humor about it. It also says a lot about him, and he understands. Were you as political back then?
Not really, Sean. I mean, you know, my book came out in 2016, Hillbilly Elegy. It's really sort of the story of growing up in poverty, achieving the American dream, starting out in business. And I really didn't care that much about politics. I certainly had views. I was a Republican, but I was not nearly as involved, obviously, as I am today. And again, it's something that really changed for me, and I think for a lot of Americans, is we saw the results of the Trump presidency compared to the obsessive, deranged media reaction in 2019 and 2020. Like, what's going on? What's so bad about this guy that he's delivered rising wages for American workers and peace in the world? Why is the media so obsessed with him? I think a lot of Americans actually have had a similar awakening over the last few years because you compare the results with the reaction, and clearly the people with the reaction to the problem, that's not President Trump's problem.
No, a lot of people forget, too, back in the first debate, I believe it was, and Kamala Harris was on the stage with Joe Biden at the time, and she said, I was that girl. If you remember that moment, yeah. It was a very hard-hitting moment. What she was referring to is the fact that Joe Biden had partnered with a former Klansman and tried to stop the integration of public schools. Joe Biden's words, he didn't want those schools to become racial jungles.
Sean, Kamala Harris basically said Joe Biden wouldn't want a little black girl like me to live in her neighborhood. He also palled around with Klansmen. She said this months before she joined his ticket, Sean. I said some bad things about Donald Trump 10 years ago, but I think it's actually important to be able, again, to admit that you're wrong. And I think I can make a good case to the American people who may have been skeptical of the president back in 2016, who can be skeptical now that we've seen the results.
All right, let's talk about a little bit